For 32 years, I poured every ounce of my soul into being the perfect mother, believing that unconditional love and sacrifice would build an unbreakable bond with my daughter. I was wrong. The day Sarah looked me in the eye and said those 5 words that would shatter my world, "Stay out of my marriage, Mom," I had no idea that my obedience to her demand would cost me everything I had worked for, everything I owned, and very nearly, my will to live. But sometimes, losing everything is exactly what you need to find yourself again. Good afternoon to everyone watching. My name is Margaret Ellen Torres, but everyone has always called me Maggie. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I'm 61 years old, and today I'm going to share with you a story that I've been afraid to tell for the past 3 years. A story about motherhood, betrayal, manipulation, and ultimately, about reclaiming a life I didn't even realize I had lost. I need to start at the beginning, because understanding how I ended up in the situation I'm about to describe requires knowing who I was, who I thought I was, and how badly I misunderstood the difference between loving someone and losing yourself in that love. I was born in 1964 in Portland, Oregon, the youngest of 4 children in a working-class family. My father was a mechanic, my mother a seamstress who took in alterations from our dining room table. Money was always tight, but love was abundant. My parents had this partnership that I admired deeply. They worked together, supported each other, never went to bed angry. That's what I wanted for myself. That's what I thought I was building. I met Thomas Reynolds when I was 23 years old. I had just finished my associate degree in early childhood education and was working at a daycare center in downtown Portland. Thomas was 27, a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm, ambitious and charming in that quiet, steady way that made you feel safe. He wasn't flashy or dramatic. He was reliable, dependable, or so I believed. We dated for 18 months before he proposed. It was nothing fancy, just the 2 of us at our favorite Italian restaurant. A small diamond ring that he had saved for months to afford. I said yes without hesitation. My parents loved him. My siblings approved. Everyone said we were perfect for each other. 2 sensible people building a sensible life together. We married in October of 1988 in a small ceremony at my parents' church. I wore my mother's wedding dress, altered to fit me. Thomas wore a rented tuxedo. We honeymooned for 3 days at the Oregon coast, staying in a modest bed and breakfast where we could hear the waves crashing against the rocks at night. Those were simple times. Uncomplicated times. Or maybe I was just too naive to see the complications that were already forming beneath the surface. Sarah came into our lives in July of 1990. After 2 years of marriage, we had decided we were ready to start our family. I was 26, Thomas was 30, and we both felt financially stable enough to take on the responsibility of parenthood. When the doctor placed that tiny, red-faced baby girl in my arms, I felt something shift inside me. This overwhelming, almost frightening surge of love that made everything else in the world fade into insignificance. From that moment on, Sarah became the center of my universe. I know that sounds like an exaggeration, like the kind of thing mothers say without really meaning it, but I mean it literally. Every decision I made, every thought I had, every plan I created revolved around what was best for Sarah. I quit my job at the daycare center to stay home with her full-time. Thomas and I agreed that having a parent at home during those crucial early years was worth the financial sacrifice. Those first few years of Sarah's life were exhausting but beautiful. The sleepless nights, the endless cycle of feeding and changing and soothing. The small victories like her first smile, her first word, her first steps. I documented everything in photo albums and journals, convinced that I was creating a record of perfect motherhood that Sarah would one day appreciate. Thomas worked long hours at the accounting firm, climbing the corporate ladder with single-minded determination. He left early every morning, and often didn't return until after Sarah was already asleep. On weekends he was usually tired, wanting to relax and decompress from his stressful work week. I told myself this was normal, that this was what supporting your spouse looked like. He provided financially, and I provided everything else. It seemed like a fair division of labor at the time. As Sarah grew from a baby into a toddler, and then into a young child, My entire identity became intertwined with being her mother. I was the room parent at her preschool, the volunteer at every school event, the one who organized birthday parties and playdates and summer activities. I made her lunches every morning with little notes tucked inside. I helped with every homework assignment, attended every recital and soccer game and school concert. Looking back now, I can see that I was substituting intensity for intimacy. I was so busy being the perfect mother that I never stopped to ask myself whether I was being the right kind of mother, whether my constant involvement was nurturing Sarah's growth or stunting it, whether my devotion was teaching her to value herself or teaching her to expect the world to revolve around her needs and wants. But at the time, I genuinely believed I was doing everything right. Every parenting book I read emphasized the importance of being present and involved. Every magazine article stressed that children needed to feel prioritized and valued. I took that advice and ran with it, never considering that there might be such a thing as too much presence, too much involvement. Thomas and I grew apart during those years, though I didn't recognize it as growing apart at the time. I thought of it as a natural evolution of marriage, the way couples shift from romantic partnership to parenting partnership. We stopped going on date nights because finding a babysitter seemed like too much effort. We stopped having meaningful conversations because we were both too tired at the end of the day. We stopped being intimate because there was always something more pressing that needed attention. By the time Sarah started middle school, Thomas and I were more like cordial roommates than husband and wife. We functioned efficiently as co-parents and household managers, but the emotional connection that had once drawn us together had withered from neglect. I told myself this was normal, that all long-term marriages went through phases like this, that we would reconnect once Sarah was older and needed us less. I was wrong about that too. Sarah was always a bright child, but she was also strong-willed and opinionated. As she entered her teenage years, those qualities intensified. We had our share of typical mother-daughter conflicts over clothes and curfews and household responsibilities. But I prided myself on maintaining open communication with her. I told her she could talk to me about anything. I positioned myself as her best friend, her confidant, her biggest supporter. What I failed to recognize was that teenage girls don't need their mothers to be their best friends. They need their mothers to be their mothers. They need boundaries and guidance, and sometimes they need to be told no, even when it makes them angry. But I was so desperate to maintain our close relationship, so terrified of losing her affection, that I often gave in when I should have stood firm. When Sarah announced at 16 that she wanted to get a tattoo, I talked Thomas into signing the parental consent form. When she wanted to take a spring break trip with friends to California, I convinced Thomas it would be fine, that she was responsible enough. When she struggled in her advanced math class and wanted to drop down to regular level, I supported her decision even though her guidance counselor advised against it. Every time Thomas questioned my approach, every time he suggested that maybe I was being too lenient or too accommodating, I defended my parenting choices vehemently. I was the one who spent all day every day with Sarah. I was the one who really knew her. He just didn't understand because he was always at work, always putting his career first, always absent from the daily realities of raising a child. That's what I told him. That's what I told myself. The truth was more complicated, but I wasn't ready to face that truth yet. Sarah graduated from high school in 2008, right as the economy was collapsing around us. Thomas's accounting firm had to make significant layoffs, and although he survived the initial cuts, his hours were reduced and his salary was frozen. Money became tight for the first time in years. We had planned to send Sarah to a 4-year university, but the financial reality made that impossible. Instead, Sarah enrolled in the local community college, living at home to save money. I told her it was only temporary, that she could transfer to a university after 2 years once our finances stabilized. She seemed fine with the arrangement at first, but I could sense her disappointment, her feeling that she was somehow falling short of what she had expected for herself. I tried to compensate by making her home life as comfortable as possible. I didn't ask her to contribute to household expenses. I still did her laundry and cooked her favorite meals and generally treated her like she was still my little girl rather than a young adult who needed to learn independence and responsibility. Thomas and I fought about this constantly. He thought Sarah should get a part-time job, should pay rent, should contribute to the household in meaningful ways. I argued that she needed to focus on her studies, that working would interfere with her education, that we could afford to support her a little longer. What I didn't say, what I could barely admit to myself, was that I needed Sarah to need me. Her dependence on me gave my life purpose and meaning. It was during Sarah's second year at community college that she met Derek Mitchell. She came home one evening glowing with excitement, announcing that she had met someone special in her psychology class. Derek was 24, 2 years older than Sarah, and working on completing his bachelor's degree after taking a few years off to work and save money. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I invited Derek to dinner the following week, eager to meet the young man who had captured my daughter's attention. When he arrived, I was immediately struck by his confidence. He was tall and well-built, with dark hair and an easy smile. He brought flowers for me and a bottle of wine for Thomas, which seemed like a thoughtful gesture. He was polite and articulate, asking interested questions about our lives and sharing entertaining stories about his own background. Derek came from a large family in Eastern Oregon. He was the youngest of 5 children, raised on a cattle ranch by parents who emphasized hard work and self-reliance. He had left home at 18, determined to make his own way in the world without relying on family money or connections. He had worked in construction, in restaurants, in retail, saving every penny until he had enough to go back to school. There was something about his self-made narrative that I found appealing. Here was a young man who understood the value of effort and perseverance. Someone who wasn't entitled or lazy like so many of Sarah's generation seemed to be. Someone who had goals and ambition. Thomas was less impressed. After Derek left that first evening, Thomas commented that Derek seemed overly smooth, too practiced in his charm. He questioned why a 24-year-old man was pursuing a relationship with a 20-year-old girl who still lived with her parents. He suggested that we encourage Sarah to take things slowly, to focus on finishing her education before getting serious with anyone. I dismissed Thomas's concerns as overprotectiveness. I thought he was being judgmental and unfair. After all, Derek was only 2 years older than Sarah. That wasn't a significant age gap. And he was in school, pursuing his education just like she was. What was wrong with Sarah dating someone ambitious and hardworking? Over the following months, Sarah and Derek's relationship intensified quickly. They were inseparable, spending every free moment together. Derek started showing up at our house more frequently, often joining us for dinner or watching television with Sarah in the living room. I welcomed his presence, happy that Sarah had found someone who seemed to care about her so deeply. Thomas continued to express reservations, but his concerns seemed vague and unsubstantiated. He didn't like how much influence Derek seemed to have over Sarah's decisions. He noticed that Sarah had stopped talking about transferring to a 4-year university, instead mentioning that Derek thought community college was good enough. He observed that Sarah had become more secretive, less willing to share details about her life and plans. I attributed these changes to normal young adult development. Of course, Sarah was becoming more private. She was growing up, establishing her own identity separate from her parents. That was healthy. That was exactly what was supposed to happen. I told Thomas he needed to let go, to stop trying to control Sarah's life, to trust that we had raised her well enough to make good decisions. In retrospect, every word of that statement was ironic. I was the one who couldn't let go. I was the one trying to maintain control. And I had raised Sarah in a way that made her vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation she was about to experience. Sarah finished her associate degree in the spring of 2010. She had originally planned to transfer to Portland State University to complete her bachelor's degree, but those plans quietly evaporated. Instead, she got a full-time job at a retail store in the mall, a position that Derek had helped her secure through a connection he had there. I tried to hide my disappointment about the abandoned university plans. I told myself it was just a delay, that she could always go back to school later. But something inside me felt uneasy, a nagging sense that things were going in the wrong direction. I pushed those feelings aside, not wanting to be negative or unsupportive. Derek and Sarah moved in together that summer into a small apartment across town. I helped them move, driving boxes of Sarah's belongings in my car, while Thomas followed in a rental truck with the few pieces of furniture she had accumulated. The apartment was in a rough neighborhood, but it was what they could afford on their combined retail incomes. I spent the first week after Sarah moved out feeling unmoored and purposeless. For 20 years, my life had revolved around her presence in my home. Now the house felt empty and too quiet. I wandered from room to room, straightening things that didn't need to be straightened, cooking elaborate meals that Thomas and I would eat in silence. Thomas tried to use this transition as an opportunity to reconnect with me. He suggested we start going out again, maybe take a weekend trip, rediscover the relationship that had existed before we became parents. But I resisted. I wasn't ready to shift my identity from mother to wife again. It felt like giving up, like admitting that the best part of my life was over. Instead, I found reasons to stay heavily involved in Sarah's life. I called her every day, sometimes multiple times. I stopped by the apartment frequently, usually bringing groceries or home-cooked meals because I worried they weren't eating properly. I offered to help clean or do laundry or run errands. Sarah initially seemed appreciative of the help, but gradually I noticed a change in her tone when I called, a tension in her voice when I showed up unannounced. Derek was always polite to me, but I sensed that my presence annoyed him. He would make subtle comments about Sarah needing to be more independent, about how his mother would never baby him the way I babied Sarah. I bristled at these remarks but tried not to show it. I didn't want to create conflict that might damage my relationship with my daughter. The engagement happened suddenly, at least from my perspective. Sarah called me one October evening, her voice bubbling with excitement. Derek had proposed during a weekend camping trip to the coast. They were planning to get married the following summer. Would I help her plan the wedding? My emotions were complicated. Part of me was happy that Sarah was happy. Part of me felt concerned that she was too young, that she was rushing into a major life decision. And part of me, the part one was ashamed to acknowledge, felt threatened by the idea of Derek becoming Sarah's primary relationship, displacing me from my position as the most important person in her life. I kept my concerns to myself, and threw myself into wedding planning with the same intensity one had brought to every other aspect of Sarah's life. Thomas and I didn't have much money saved, but I was determined to give Sarah the wedding she deserved. We took out a loan against our home equity to cover the costs, a decision that Thomas opposed but I insisted on. The wedding took place in June of 2011 at a small vineyard outside Portland. It was a beautiful day, sunny and warm with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of roses from the garden. Sarah looked radiant in the wedding dress we had spent months finding, a simple but elegant design that suited her perfectly. I cried through the entire ceremony, though I couldn't have said whether those were tears of joy or grief, or some combination of both. As I watched Sarah exchange vows with Derek, promising to love and honor him for the rest of her life, I felt like I was losing something precious, though I couldn't articulate exactly what it was. At the reception, I gave a toast that I had carefully prepared. I talked about watching Sarah grow from a tiny baby into the remarkable woman standing before us. I shared stories about her childhood, about the close bond we had always shared, about my hopes and dreams for her future happiness. Several people told me afterward that it was a beautiful speech, though Thomas later commented that it had focused more on my relationship with Sarah than on Sarah's relationship with Derek. He was right, though I didn't want to admit it at the time. Even in celebrating Sarah's marriage, I was making it about me, about us, about what I had given and sacrificed and provided. I was so focused on my role as mother that I couldn't step back and see my daughter as a separate individual embarking on her own journey. After the wedding, Sarah and Derek moved into a slightly larger apartment on the other side of Portland. I continued my pattern of frequent contact, calling daily and visiting at least once a week. Sarah's responses to my involvement became increasingly strained, but I interpreted her occasional irritation as stress from adjusting to married life rather than as a message that I needed to back off. Thomas and I were barely speaking by this point, except when necessary for household logistics. The debt from the wedding had created additional financial strain, and Thomas resented that we had taken on that burden against his better judgment. He had suggested that Sarah and Derek have a smaller wedding, or wait until they could save money to pay for it themselves, but I had overruled him. Our marriage had become a shell, held together only by inertia and the shared history of 30 years together. We slept in the same bed but might as well have been in different rooms. We ate meals together but rarely had conversations beyond superficial small talk. The distance between us had grown so gradually that I barely noticed it happening, too focused on maintaining my connection to Sarah to recognize that I had completely severed my connection to my husband. Then came Thanksgiving of 2012, the day everything began to change, though I didn't recognize it as a turning point at the time. We had always hosted Thanksgiving at our house, a tradition I had maintained since Sarah was born. That year, Sarah called 2 days before the holiday to tell me that she and Derek would be spending Thanksgiving with Derek's family at their ranch in Eastern Oregon instead of joining us. I was devastated. Thanksgiving was our holiday, our tradition. How could she just abandon it without even discussing it with me first? I tried to guilt her into changing her plans, reminding her of all the Thanksgivings we had shared over the years, suggesting that Derek's family wouldn't miss them as much as I would. Sarah got defensive, saying that Derek wanted to see his family too, that they had to split their time between both families fairly. We ended the call on bad terms, with both of us upset and neither willing to concede. Thomas and I spent Thanksgiving alone that year, eating a meal I had prepared without enthusiasm, the empty chairs at the table a glaring reminder of Sarah's absence. I sulked through the entire day, feeling sorry for myself and angry at my daughter for putting her husband's wishes before mine. That incident marked the beginning of a pattern. Over the following months, Sarah started choosing Derek's preferences and Derek's family over time with me. When I complained, she would get irritated, accusing me of being selfish and unreasonable. When I tried to discuss my feelings with Thomas, he would say that this was natural, that married couples had to establish their own traditions, that I needed to let Sarah go. But I couldn't let go. Or wouldn't. The distinction between those two things was something I would only understand much later. The next major shift came in the spring of 2013, when Sarah announced she was pregnant. She called me on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She was 8 weeks along, due in early November. Derek was thrilled. They were already starting to prepare the second bedroom in their apartment as a nursery. My reaction was complicated. Outwardly, I expressed joy and congratulations. Inwardly, I felt a surge of emotions I couldn't quite name. Concern that Sarah was too young and financially unstable for parenthood. Anxiety about whether she was ready for this responsibility. But also, and this is the part I'm least proud of, a kind of vindication. A baby would mean Sarah would need me again. My expertise, my help, my presence would become necessary once more. I immediately began making plans. I researched the best pediatricians in Sarah's neighborhood. I started buying baby items whenever I saw sales, accumulating a collection of clothes and toys and equipment that quickly filled our spare bedroom. I checked out armloads of parenting books from the library and highlighted relevant sections to share with Sarah. I even started researching daycare options, convinced that Sarah would need to return to work after maternity leave, and would want my input on choosing the right facility. Thomas watched my frenetic preparation with concern. He suggested that I was getting too involved again, that Sarah and Derek needed space to figure out parenthood on their own. I dismissed his concerns. This was different. Sarah would need practical help with a newborn. I was just being a supportive mother and soon-to-be grandmother. Throughout Sarah's pregnancy, I called her constantly with advice and suggestions. I showed up at her apartment with bags of supplies I thought she needed. I invited myself to her prenatal appointments, hurt when she sometimes asked me not to come because Derek wanted to be there alone with her. I planned an elaborate baby shower at our house, inviting everyone I could think of even though Sarah had mentioned wanting something small and low-key. Looking back, I can see that I was smothering her. I was treating her pregnancy like it was my experience rather than hers. Every decision I made was about satisfying my own needs rather than respecting her autonomy. But at the time, I genuinely believed I was being helpful, that my involvement was wanted and appreciated. The baby shower was a disaster, though I didn't recognize it as such until much later. I had invited over 40 people to our house, decorating elaborately with pink and purple balloons and streamers since Sarah was having a girl. I had ordered an expensive cake and catered food, going into further debt to make sure everything was perfect. Sarah arrived looking tired and overwhelmed. She smiled and thanked everyone for coming, but I could see the strain in her eyes. Derek stayed close to her side, whispering things I couldn't hear, his hand protectively on her back. Several times during the party, I saw him checking his watch, clearly eager to leave. At one point during the gift opening, I made a comment about how I would be available to babysit whenever Sarah needed me, how I had already cleared my schedule to be on call as much as necessary. Derek's expression tightened, and I saw him squeeze Sarah's hand. Sarah quickly changed the subject, but the tension in the room was palpable. After they left, Thomas confronted me about my behavior. He said I had been overbearing throughout the shower, making everything about what I was going to do to help rather than celebrating Sarah and Derek as the parents. He pointed out that I had barely acknowledged Derek during the entire party, referring to the baby as my granddaughter rather than their daughter. He suggested that I was setting myself up for disappointment and conflict. We had one of our worst arguments that night. I accused Thomas of being unsupportive and jealous of my relationship with Sarah. He accused me of being unable to see how unhealthy my obsession with our daughter had become. We both said things that couldn't be taken back. The argument ended with Thomas sleeping in the guest room, a temporary arrangement that would eventually become permanent. Sarah's daughter, my granddaughter Emma, was born on November 7, 2013. It was a difficult labor lasting over 16 hours, and Sarah had to have an emergency cesarean section. I spent those hours in the hospital waiting room, pacing and praying and checking my phone constantly for updates from Derek. When I finally got to meet Emma, holding her tiny, perfect body in my arms for the first time, I felt that same overwhelming surge of love I had experienced when Sarah was born. This beautiful little girl was part of me, part of my legacy, part of my purpose. I already knew I would do anything for her. Sarah stayed in the hospital for 3 days recovering from the surgery. I visited every day, often staying for hours even though I could tell Sarah was exhausted and needed rest. I brought food and flowers and gifts. I gave unsolicited advice about breastfeeding and diaper changing and infant sleep patterns. I criticized some of the nurses, convinced I could provide better care than they could. Derek's patience with me was visibly wearing thin. He made comments about the hospital having visiting hour guidelines. He positioned himself physically between me and Sarah during my visits, creating a subtle but clear barrier. When the hospital social worker came to discuss postpartum care, Derek specifically requested that she provide information about setting boundaries with well-meaning, but overly involved family members. I overheard that conversation and felt hurt and angry. How could Derek characterize my love and support as a problem that needed boundaries? I was trying to help. I was trying to be there for my daughter, during one of the most challenging times in her life. What kind of husband tries to separate a mother from her child? The ride home from the hospital should have been a warning sign. Derek drove, Sarah sat in the passenger seat, and I sat in the back next to Emma's car seat. I kept reaching forward to adjust the straps on the car seat, convinced they weren't properly secured. Derek finally pulled over and firmly told me to stop, that he had installed the car seat correctly, and had it inspected by a certified technician. His tone was sharp, brooking no argument. Sarah didn't defend me. She just stared straight ahead, silent and exhausted, not intervening in the conflict between her husband and her mother. That should have told me everything I needed to know about whose side she was on, about how she was starting to perceive my involvement. But I was too hurt and too convinced of my own rightness to see it. The first few weeks after Emma's birth set a pattern that would eventually lead to disaster. I called Sarah multiple times every day, ostensibly to check on how she was doing but really to offer advice and insert myself into their routine. I showed up at their apartment unannounced with meals and supplies, letting myself in with the spare key Sarah had given me for emergencies. I stayed for hours, holding Emma while Sarah tried to rest, criticizing Derek's clumsy attempts at diaper changing or bottle preparation. I repositioned items in the nursery to match what I thought was a better arrangement. I openly disagreed with some of their parenting choices, like using pacifiers or letting Emma nap in a swing instead of a crib. Derek's resentment toward me grew more apparent. He made pointed comments about needing privacy as a family. He started being home less often, working extra shifts at his job, or finding reasons to be out of the apartment when I visited. When he was home during my visits, he would retreat to the bedroom, closing the door as a clear signal that I wasn't welcome in every space. Sarah seemed caught in the middle, torn between her loyalty to her husband and her ingrained pattern of accommodating me. She rarely contradicted me directly, but I could see the stress building in her face, in her posture, in the way she would flinch slightly when my phone number appeared on her screen. Thomas continued to criticize my behavior. He said I was driving a wedge between Sarah and Derek, that I was making their transition to parenthood more difficult instead of easier, that I needed to back off and let them figure things out on their own. I accused him of not caring about his daughter and granddaughter, of being content to abandon them when they needed family support the most. Our marriage was effectively over by this point, though neither of us had said it out loud. We lived as strangers in the same house, barely speaking, maintaining separate routines. Thomas had started working later hours, finding reasons to stay at the office rather than come home. I suspected he might be having an affair, but I couldn't bring myself to care enough to investigate. All my emotional energy was focused on Sarah and Emma. They were my purpose, my reason for existing. Without them, I wasn't sure who I was or what my life meant. The breaking point came on a rainy Saturday afternoon in March of 2014, when Emma was 4 months old. I had let myself into Sarah and Derek's apartment using my spare key, carrying bags of groceries and baby items I had purchased. Sarah and Derek were in the bedroom with the door closed. I could hear them talking in low, intense voices, clearly in the middle of an argument. I started putting away the groceries, organizing their kitchen cabinets the way I thought they should be arranged, when Derek emerged from the bedroom. His face was flushed, his jaw tight with barely controlled anger. He walked straight to me and held out his hand. "Give me the key," he said, his voice low but firm. "You can't keep letting yourself into our home whenever you want. This is our space, our family, and you need to respect our boundaries." I felt like I had been slapped. I looked past him toward the bedroom, expecting Sarah to emerge and defend me, to tell Derek he was being unreasonable. But the bedroom door stayed closed. "I'm just trying to help," I said, hearing the tremor in my voice. "Sarah needs support right now. Being a new mother is overwhelming." "Sarah has support," Derek replied, his hand still extended for the key. "She has me. And when she needs her mother, she will ask for you. But showing up unannounced, inserting yourself into every aspect of our lives, giving constant unsolicited advice, that's not support. That's control." The word hung in the air between us. Control. Was that what I had been doing? From my perspective, I had been loving, helping, being present. But hearing Derek describe it as control made me question everything, even as I resented him for the accusation. I reluctantly pulled the key from my keychain and placed it in his palm. "Fine," I said, trying to keep my dignity intact. "If that's how you want it." "That's how we both want it," Derek clarified. "Sarah and I have discussed this many times. We need space to build our family without constant interference. We need to make our own decisions and our own mistakes without commentary or criticism." Before I could respond, before I could argue or defend myself or appeal to Sarah directly, Derek opened the front door, a clear signal that I was expected to leave. I gathered my purse and walked out, feeling humiliated and wronged, certain that Derek was poisoning my daughter against me. I drove home through blurred vision, tears streaming down my face, replaying the confrontation in my mind. How dare he speak to me that way? How dare he take my key and throw me out like I was some kind of unwelcome intruder? I was Sarah's mother. I had rights. I had a relationship with my daughter that predated his existence in her life by over 20 years. When I got home, Thomas was there, which was unusual for a Saturday afternoon. I told him what had happened, expecting sympathy and support. Instead, he sighed deeply and said that Derek was right, that I had been overstepping for months, that this confrontation was inevitable and probably overdue. We had another terrible argument. I accused Thomas of always taking Derek's side, of never supporting me, of being a terrible father and husband. He said I had become so obsessed with controlling Sarah's life that I had destroyed our marriage, and was now destroying my relationship with my daughter. He said he couldn't watch me self-destruct anymore, that he was done trying to make me see reason. The next morning, Thomas moved his remaining belongings out of our bedroom, and officially took up residence in the guest room. We barely spoke after that except when absolutely necessary. Our marriage existed only on paper, two people trapped in the same house by financial constraints and inertia, but emotionally divorced in every meaningful way. I tried to respect Derek's demand for space, I really did. I reduced my calls to Sarah from multiple times a day to once a day, then to every other day. I stopped showing up unannounced, always calling first to ask if I could visit. But even those reduced efforts were met with resistance. Sarah often said she was busy or tired, suggesting we get together later in the week. Those later dates were frequently postponed or canceled. I could feel Sarah slipping away from me, and it terrified me. The close relationship we had always shared was being replaced by polite distance. Conversations that used to flow easily now felt stilted and awkward. Sarah volunteered less information about her life, deflecting my questions with vague responses. When I did manage to visit, I could feel Derek's watchful presence, monitoring my interactions with Sarah and Emma, ready to intervene if I overstepped. Mother's Day of 2014 was particularly painful. I had hoped Sarah would want to spend the day with me, maybe go out for brunch or bring Emma over to visit. Instead, Sarah called briefly to wish me a happy Mother's Day, explaining that Derek had planned a special day for them as a family. She sent me a card and a small gift basket, thoughtful but impersonal, the kind of thing you give to someone you feel obligated to acknowledge, but don't actually want to spend time with. I spent that Mother's Day alone. Thomas was playing golf with some colleagues. I sat in the house surrounded by photo albums and scrapbooks documenting Sarah's childhood, mourning a relationship that felt like it was dying despite all my efforts to keep it alive. Summer came and went with increasingly infrequent contact. Sarah's responses to my calls became shorter and less engaged. My requests to visit were often denied with flimsy excuses. When I did see Emma, she seemed uncertain around me, not recognizing me as someone familiar and safe. That hurt more than anything, watching my granddaughter look at me with wary confusion instead of love and recognition. By fall of 2014, I had fallen into a deep depression. I had no purpose, no identity beyond being Sarah's mother, and that role was being stripped away from me. I stopped taking care of myself, sleeping too much or not at all, eating irregularly, letting the house fall into disarray. Thomas expressed concern but kept his distance, unwilling to be pulled into my emotional spiral. Then came the conversation that would change everything. It was a Tuesday evening in October, almost exactly a year after Emma's birth. Sarah called and asked if she could come over to talk. She sounded serious, and I felt a flutter of hope. Maybe she was ready to reconcile, to admit that Derek had been too harsh, to restore our close relationship. Sarah arrived at 7:30 that evening, and I could immediately sense something was different about her. She carried herself with a stiffness that seemed unnatural, her shoulders squared in a way that suggested she had rehearsed what she was about to say. She declined my offer of tea, choosing instead to sit across from me at the dining room table rather than on the comfortable sofa, where we used to curl up together during our talks. The formality of her posture made my stomach clench with anxiety. This wasn't going to be the reconciliation I had hoped for. I could see it in her eyes, in the way she clasped her hands together on the table, in the deliberate breath she took before speaking. "Mom, we need to talk about boundaries," she began, and I felt my defenses immediately rising. That word again. Boundaries. Derek's word, not Sarah's. I was certain he had coached her, prepared her for this conversation, maybe even insisted that she have it. "I know this has been difficult for you," Sarah continued, her voice steady but lacking warmth. "The transition to me being married, having my own family. But Mom, your level of involvement in my life has become unhealthy for all of us. For me, for Derek, for Emma, and honestly for you too." I started to interrupt, to defend myself, but Sarah held up her hand. "Please let me finish. I've been trying to figure out how to say this for months, and if I don't get it all out now, I won't be able to." She took another breath, and I could see her gathering courage. "Your constant calls, your unannounced visits, your opinions about every decision Derek and I make, it's suffocating me. I know you think you're helping, but you're not. You're making it impossible for me to learn how to be a mother, how to trust my own instincts, how to build a partnership with my husband." Each word felt like a physical blow. I sat frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. This was my daughter, the child I had devoted my entire life to raising, telling me that my love and care was suffocating her. "I love you, Mom," Sarah continued, and I could hear emotion creeping into her voice now. "But I need you to understand that I'm an adult. I'm a wife and a mother. I need to make my own choices, even if they're not the choices you would make. I need to succeed on my own terms and fail on my own terms. And I can't do that with you constantly hovering over every aspect of my life." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the distant sound of traffic outside. Everything except the words I needed to say, because I couldn't find them. I felt like I was drowning, gasping for air but finding none. "What are you saying?" I finally managed to ask, though I already knew the answer. I just couldn't bear to hear it confirmed. Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I'm saying that I need space. Real space. I need you to stop calling me every day. I need you to stop asking to visit all the time. I need you to stop giving me advice unless I specifically ask for it. I need you to stay out of my marriage, Mom. Derek and I need to figure things out on our own, without your constant input and interference." There it was. Stay out of my marriage. The words that would echo in my mind for years to come. The words that felt like a rejection of everything I had ever been, everything I had ever tried to do for my daughter. "But I'm your mother," I whispered, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "This is what mothers do. They help their children. They're there for them. How can you ask me to just step back and watch you struggle when I could make things easier for you?" Sarah wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "That's exactly the problem, Mom. You think you're making things easier, but you're not. You're taking away my agency. You're treating me like I'm still a child who can't function without you. And the more you do that, the more you undermine my confidence in myself." She leaned forward, her expression earnest. "I need to know that I can handle my own life. I need to build that competence and self-assurance. And I can't do that if you're always swooping in to rescue me or correct me, or show me the right way to do things. Don't you see? By trying to help, you're actually hurting me." I felt anger rising up through the hurt, hot and defensive. "Is this Derek talking?" I asked, unable to keep the accusation out of my voice. "Did he put you up to this? Because this doesn't sound like you, Sarah. This sounds like someone else's agenda." Sarah's expression hardened. "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Mom. You can't accept that I might have my own thoughts and feelings about this. You have to blame Derek, make him the villain, because otherwise you'd have to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, you've been overstepping." She stood up, and I could see her hands were shaking. "Derek supports me, yes. He validates my feelings when I express frustration about your behavior. But these are my feelings, Mom. Mine. I'm the one who feels suffocated. I'm the one who needs space. This conversation is happening because I need it to happen, not because Derek is controlling me." The irony of her words struck me even through my distress. She was accusing me of not respecting her autonomy, while I sat there convinced that Derek was the one manipulating her. Neither of us could see clearly in that moment. We were both too hurt, too defensive, too convinced of our own perspective. "So what exactly are you asking for?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you want me to just disappear from your life? Pretend I don't have a daughter or a granddaughter?" Sarah sighed, and I could see the exhaustion in her face. "I'm not asking you to disappear. I'm asking you to pull back. Way back. I'll call you once a week to check in. You can visit once a month, but only if you ask first and I confirm it works for us. And when you do visit, you need to respect that it's our home and our rules. No criticizing, no rearranging things, no unsolicited advice. Once a month." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. She was rationing our relationship, putting me on a strict schedule like I was some kind of nuisance that needed to be managed. "What about Emma?" I asked, grasping at straws. "I'm her grandmother. Don't I have a right to be part of her life?" Sarah's expression softened slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. "You are part of her life, Mom. But your relationship with Emma needs to develop naturally, not be forced or manufactured through constant contact. She needs to know you as her grandmother, not as someone who's always there trying to take over. This is Derek's doing," I insisted, unable to let it go. He's poisoned you against me. He's always resented our close relationship. And now he's using this boundary nonsense to drive a wedge between us. Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. Stop it, Mom. Just stop. This is not about Derek. This is about you and me and a pattern that's been going on since I was a child. You've always been too involved, too controlling, too unable to let me have my own experiences without your constant management. She moved toward the door, clearly done with the conversation. I'm going to leave now. I'm going to give you time to think about what I've said. But Mom, I need you to understand that this isn't a negotiation. These boundaries are happening whether you agree with them or not. The only question is whether you're going to respect them and maintain a relationship with me, or fight them and push me away completely. With that, she walked out, leaving me sitting alone at the dining room table, feeling like my world had just collapsed around me. I sat there for hours after she left, replaying the conversation in my mind, alternating between hurt and anger and disbelief. Thomas came home around 10 and found me still sitting in the same spot. He took in my tear-stained face and slumped posture, and asked what happened. I told him about the conversation, expecting sympathy, expecting him to agree that Sarah was being unfair and unreasonable. Instead, he nodded slowly and said that maybe this was the wake-up call I needed. Maybe this was an opportunity to finally examine my behavior and make some real changes. I exploded at him, accusing him of taking Sarah's side, of never supporting me, of being a terrible partner who abandoned me when I needed him most. Thomas just looked at me with something that resembled pity. Maggie, I've been trying to tell you for years that your relationship with Sarah was unhealthy. You wouldn't listen. Maybe you'll listen now that Sarah herself is telling you the same thing. He left me there and went to bed. I sat in the darkness of the dining room until nearly 2 a.m, my mind racing through decades of memories, trying to understand how we had arrived at this point. How had I gone from being Sarah's beloved mother to someone she needed to establish strict boundaries with? The next few weeks were torture. I honored Sarah's request that I not call her, though every day I picked up the phone a dozen times before forcing myself to put it back down. I jumped every time my phone rang, hoping it would be her, but it never was. The silence between us felt like a living thing, growing larger and more oppressive with each passing day. I tried to distract myself with activities, signing up for a yoga class and a book club at the local library, but I couldn't concentrate on anything. My mind kept circling back to Sarah, to Emma, to the relationship that had been the center of my existence, and was now reduced to once-weekly phone calls and monthly visits. Thomas and I barely spoke. The gulf between us had grown so wide that conversation felt pointless. We moved around each other like ghosts, sharing space but not life. I knew our marriage was effectively dead, but I couldn't bring myself to care about fixing it. All my emotional energy was consumed by my estrangement from Sarah. When the first weekly call finally came, I pounced on the phone before the second ring. Sarah's voice was polite but distant, asking general questions about how I was doing, sharing surface-level information about her week. The call lasted exactly 20 minutes, and when it ended, I felt more alone than I had before it started. This became our new pattern. One 20-minute call per week, scheduled for Tuesday evenings at 7. Sarah controlled the conversation, keeping things superficial, deflecting any attempts I made to dig deeper or offer advice. She shared photos of Emma via text, but made it clear that commentary beyond simple appreciation was not welcome. My first scheduled visit came in early November, and I prepared for it like it was a job interview. I bought gifts for Emma, carefully selected to be age-appropriate and non-controversial. I rehearsed responses in my head, practicing keeping my opinions to myself, reminding myself not to criticize or correct or suggest better ways of doing things. The visit was stilted and uncomfortable. Sarah and Derek were polite but guarded. Emma, now a year old, seemed wary of me, crying when I tried to hold her. I spent 2 hours in their apartment feeling like an unwelcome guest, watching my daughter parent my granddaughter, while I sat on the sidelines, forbidden to participate in any meaningful way. When I left that day, I cried the entire drive home. This wasn't a relationship. This was a performance, a carefully managed interaction designed to keep me at arm's length while maintaining the appearance of family connection. I felt like I had lost my daughter even though we were technically still in contact. The holidays that year were another painful reminder of how much had changed. Sarah and Derek spent Thanksgiving with his family again, offering me a brief phone call instead of in-person time. Christmas was divided, with Sarah agreeing to stop by our house for a few hours on Christmas Eve before spending Christmas Day with Derek's family. The Christmas Eve visit felt forced and obligatory. Sarah watched the clock the entire time, clearly counting down until she could leave. Emma fussed and cried, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar environment and the stranger trying to engage with her. The gifts I had bought seemed inadequate and misguided. The meal I prepared went largely uneaten. When they finally left after 3 uncomfortable hours, I felt more depressed than I had before they arrived. Thomas spent most of Christmas in the guest room, avoiding me and my obvious misery. We exchanged gifts out of obligation rather than affection. Practical items we each needed rather than anything thoughtful or personal. I couldn't remember the last time we had said I love you to each other. The marriage that had once been the foundation of my life had withered into nothing more than a legal arrangement. The new year arrived with no sense of hope or fresh starts. I was stuck in a pattern of grief and resentment, unable to move forward, but also unable to go back to how things used to be. I spent most of my time alone, having let my few friendships atrophy over the years in favor of focusing exclusively on Sarah. I had built my entire identity around being a mother, and now that role had been stripped down to almost nothing. It was in February of 2015, during one of our weekly calls, that Sarah dropped another bombshell. "Mom, Derek got a promotion at work," she said, her voice carrying a forced brightness that I had learned to recognize as her trying to deliver news she knew I wouldn't like. "It's a really great opportunity, but it means we're going to be relocating." My heart stopped. Relocating? Where? "His company is opening a new branch in Sacramento. We'll be moving in March. The promotion comes with a significant raise and better benefits, so it's really the right move for our family." Sacramento, California. Over 600 miles away. She might as well have said she was moving to the moon. I felt panic rising in my chest, making it difficult to breathe. "Sarah, you can't," I said, hearing the desperation in my voice. "Emma is so young. You need family support. What about when she gets sick or when you need help? What about her relationship with her grandmother?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mom, this is exactly what I meant about staying out of my marriage. This is Derek's career. This is our decision as a family. We're not asking for your permission or your approval." "But 600 miles," I protested. "I'll barely get to see you. Emma won't even know who I am." "We'll visit," Sarah said, though her tone suggested she was already pulling away, already building walls to protect herself from my reaction. "And there's FaceTime and video calls. Lots of families maintain relationships across distance. It's not the end of the world." For her, maybe it wasn't. But for me, it felt like exactly that. The end of everything I had built my life around. The final severing of the connection that had defined my existence for 32 years. After the call ended, I sat in stunned silence for a long time. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I went to Thomas and told him what Sarah had said. I expected him to be upset, to share my distress about our daughter moving across the country. Instead, he just nodded and said that it made sense for them to take advantage of Derek's opportunity. "Don't you care?" I demanded. "Don't you care that we're losing our daughter and granddaughter?" Thomas looked at me with tired eyes. "Maggie, we lost Sarah a long time ago. Not because she moved away, but because you couldn't let her grow up and have her own life. Maybe the physical distance will actually help. Maybe it will force you to finally let go." I hated him in that moment. Hated his calmness, his reasonableness, his apparent indifference to what I was experiencing. But underneath the hatred was a terrible suspicion that he might be right. Sarah and Derek moved to Sacramento in the last week of March. Sarah called to let me know they had arrived safely, that the apartment was nice, that Derek was excited to start his new position. She didn't invite me to visit. She didn't even suggest a time frame for when they might come back to Oregon. The weekly phone calls continued, but they became even shorter and more superficial. Sarah was always busy, always distracted, always ready to end the conversation after 10 or 15 minutes. She sent occasional photos of Emma, But they were the kind of generic kid photos any proud parent might post on social media, not the intimate glimpses into her life that I craved. I fell into a deep depression that spring and summer. I had no purpose, no reason to get out of bed, no motivation to take care of myself or the house. Thomas was gone more than he was home. And when he was there, we existed in separate spheres, two people who happened to live in the same building but shared nothing else. I knew I should see a therapist, should get help for the depression that was consuming me. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. That would mean admitting that something was wrong with me, that my perspective might be flawed, that maybe I had contributed to my own misery. I wasn't ready to face those possibilities. Instead, I spent my days obsessively checking Sarah's social media accounts, looking for clues about her life in California. I could see photos of her and Derek and Emma doing things together, going to parks and beaches, celebrating milestones. I could see that Sarah was building a life there, a life that didn't include me. Each photo felt like a knife to the heart. There was Emma learning to walk, taking her first steps in some California park, while I sat hundreds of miles away completely unaware it was happening. There was Emma's second birthday party, a celebration I wasn't invited to, surrounded by new friends Sarah had made in Sacramento. There was Sarah and Derek on date nights, looking happy and relaxed in a way I couldn't remember them looking when they lived in Oregon. I wanted to be happy for them. I wanted to see their success and joy and celebrate it with them. But all I could feel was grief and resentment, and a terrible sense of having been erased from my own daughter's life. It was in September, almost exactly a year after Sarah had first asked me to respect boundaries, that Thomas finally told me he wanted a divorce. He said it calmly, without drama or anger, sitting across from me at the same dining room table where Sarah had delivered her boundary speech. "I can't do this anymore, Maggie," he said simply. "We haven't had a real marriage for years, maybe decades. I've stayed this long out of obligation and inertia, but I'm 62 years old, and I don't want to spend whatever years I have left living like this. I should have been devastated. The end of a 30-year marriage should have broken me. But I felt almost nothing. Thomas leaving was just one more loss in a long series of losses, and I had no emotional capacity left to process it. We agreed to sell the house and split the proceeds. Thomas moved out in October, renting a small apartment closer to his office. I stayed in the house until it sold, which took until January of 2016. During those months alone in that house, I hit what I now recognize as rock bottom. I barely ate. I slept 16 hours a day. I stopped answering the phone when Sarah called for our weekly check-ins, which meant she stopped calling at all. I let the housekeeping go until the place was a disaster. I wore the same clothes for days at a time. I lost nearly 20 pounds. I existed in a fog of depression and self-pity, unable to see any path forward. It was my sister Janet who finally intervened. She lived in Seattle, and we hadn't been close for years. Another relationship I had let atrophy in favor of focusing on Sarah. But somehow she heard through the family grapevine that Thomas and I were divorcing, and she showed up at my door one cold February morning. The look of horror on her face when she saw me told me everything I needed to know about how far I had fallen. She took one look at me and the house, and immediately went into crisis management mode. She cleaned while I protested weekly. She ordered groceries and made me eat. She sat with me while I cried and rambled about everything I had lost. And then, after 3 days of this, she sat me down and delivered some hard truths. "Maggie, you need professional help. You're depressed, you're grieving, and you're stuck in patterns of thinking that are destroying you. I can't fix this for you. No one can accept you. But you have to want to get better. You have to want to build a life that's about more than just being Sarah's mother." I resisted at first. I made excuses. I blamed everyone else for my situation. But Janet was relentless. She found a therapist who specialized in family estrangement and depression. She made the first appointment for me and drove me there herself. She stayed in Portland for 2 weeks, making sure I went to therapy, making sure I ate, making sure I didn't slip back into the abyss. That first therapy session was brutal. Dr. Rebecca Chen asked me questions I didn't want to answer, pointed out patterns I didn't want to see, suggested interpretations of my behavior that made me defensive and angry. But she also offered something I desperately needed, which was hope that change was possible. Over the following months, I began the painful work of examining my life and my choices. In therapy, I started to see how my identity had become completely enmeshed with Sarah's from the moment she was born. How I had used her to fill voids in my own life, instead of doing the hard work of building a full identity for myself. How my inability to let her separate and individuate had damaged both of us. Dr. Chen introduced me to concepts I had never considered. Enmeshment, codependency, emotional incest. That last term particularly horrified me, but as she explained it, as she showed me how I had expected Sarah to meet emotional needs that should have been met by adult relationships or by my own inner resources, I couldn't deny the accuracy of the description. I learned that healthy parenting involves gradual letting go, teaching children to function independently, celebrating their separation rather than resisting it. I learned that true love doesn't require constant contact or control. I learned that my behavior, which I had always framed as devotion and care, had actually been selfish, serving my needs rather than Sarah's. These realizations were excruciating. They meant acknowledging that I had failed as a mother in fundamental ways. That I had damaged my daughter while believing I was loving her. That I had driven away the person I loved most through my desperate attempts to hold on to her. The house sold in March, and I moved into a small one-bedroom apartment across town. It was a deliberate downsizing, a symbolic shedding of my old life. I kept only what I truly needed, donating or throwing away decades of accumulated possessions. Each item I let go of felt like releasing a small piece of the person I used to be. I continued therapy twice a week throughout the spring. Dr. Chen encouraged me to join a support group for parents experiencing estrangement from adult children. I resisted at first, ashamed to admit that I was one of those parents whose children had cut them off. But when I finally attended my first meeting, I was shocked to discover that the room was full of people just like me. There were 15 of us in that church basement, mostly mothers, all mourning the loss of relationships with our adult children. As we went around the circle sharing our stories, I heard my own experience reflected back to me again and again. The devotion that became control. The help that became interference. The love that became suffocation. The inability to see our children as separate people with their own autonomy. Not all of these parents were ready to take responsibility for their part in the estrangement. Some were still firmly in the victim mindset, convinced that their children had been turned against them by spouses or therapists or society. But a few, like me, were beginning to do the hard work of self-examination. Those were the people I connected with, the ones who became my support system as I navigated this painful transformation. Through therapy and the support group, I gradually began to build a life that didn't revolve around Sarah. I got a part-time job at a bookstore, something I had always enjoyed but never pursued because I was too busy being a full-time mother. I joined a hiking group and started exploring trails around Portland. I took a creative writing class at the community college, discovering a passion for storytelling that I had suppressed for decades. These activities were initially just ways to fill time, distractions from the grief and emptiness. But slowly they began to become meaningful in their own right. I started to develop friendships with people who knew me as Maggie, not as Sarah's mother. I started to have experiences and interests that belonged to me alone. I still thought about Sarah every day. I still missed her and Emma with an ache that never completely went away. But I was learning to carry that grief without letting it consume my entire existence. I was learning that it was possible to love someone deeply, while also giving them the space they needed, even when that space felt like abandonment. In August, almost a year after I had started therapy, Dr. Chen suggested that I might be ready to reach out to Sarah again. Not to demand anything or expect anything, but simply to apologize. To take responsibility for my behavior without making excuses or asking for forgiveness. To let Sarah know that I was doing the work to change, not to win her back, but because it was the right thing to do. I spent weeks crafting a letter to Sarah. I wrote and rewrote it dozens of times, removing defensive language, taking out justifications, eliminating anything that might sound like I was blaming her or Derek. What remained was a simple, honest acknowledgement of my mistakes and a genuine apology for the pain I had caused. I didn't expect a response. Dr. Chen had prepared me for the possibility that Sarah might not be ready to engage, that she might need more time, that she might never be ready. But 3 weeks after I mailed the letter, my phone rang with a Sacramento number. "Mom," Sarah said when I answered, her voice thick with emotion. "I got your letter." My hands trembled as I held the phone to my ear, afraid to breathe, afraid that any sound might shatter this fragile moment of connection. Sarah's voice sounded different somehow, softer than it had been in our stilted weekly conversations, more like the daughter I remembered from years ago. "Thank you for writing it," she continued, and I could hear her taking a steadying breath. "I've read it probably 20 times in the past few weeks." I wasn't sure how to respond or if I even should respond. "But Derek convinced me that you deserve to know that I received it, and that it meant something to me." I waited, giving her space to say whatever she needed to say, practicing the skills Dr. Chun had taught me about listening without defending or explaining. "The apology means a lot, Mom. It's the first time you've taken real responsibility without making excuses or blaming someone else. And I can tell from what you wrote that you've been doing actual work on yourself, not just saying what you think I want to hear." Tears were streaming down my face, but I kept my voice steady. "I am doing the work, Sarah. Not to manipulate you into letting me back into your life, but because I finally understand that the way I was living wasn't healthy for anyone, especially not for me." There was a long pause, and I could hear muffled sounds in the background, Emma's voice asking for something, Derek responding. The ordinary sounds of family life that I was no longer part of, that I had forfeited through my own actions. "I'm not ready to go back to how things were," Sarah said finally. "I don't know if we'll ever go back to that, honestly. But I think maybe we could try something new. Something healthier. If you're really committed to respecting the boundaries we've set." "I am," I said immediately, then caught myself. I'm working on it. I'm learning. I still make mistakes sometimes in my thinking, but I'm trying to catch myself and do better." Sarah made a sound that might have been a small laugh. "See, that's different too. The old you would have just insisted you'd changed completely, and everything would be perfect from now on. This feels more real." We talked for almost an hour that day, the longest conversation we'd had in over a year. It wasn't easy or comfortable. Sarah was honest about the hurt I had caused, about the resentment she still carried, about her fears that I would slip back into old patterns. I listened without defending myself, acknowledging her feelings, validating her experience even when it was painful to hear. Before we hung up, Sarah suggested that maybe we could try video calls once a month so I could see Emma. Not frequent contact, not the constant involvement I used to demand, but a small opening, a tentative step toward rebuilding something. Over the following months, Sarah and I developed a new relationship. It was nothing like what we'd had before, and I had to constantly grieve the loss of that old closeness while trying to appreciate what we were building now. The monthly video calls were brief but genuine. I got to see Emma growing, to hear about Sarah's life in California, to share small pieces of my own journey. I continued therapy and the support group, using both to process the complicated emotions that came with this gradual reconnection. There were setbacks. Times when I slipped into old patterns and had to apologize again. Times when Sarah needed to pull back, because I had pushed too hard. But we kept trying, both of us, to find a way forward. It was during one of our video calls in December that Sarah told me something that changed everything. "Mom, I need to tell you something. And I need you to just listen without reacting, okay?" My stomach clenched with anxiety, but I nodded. "Okay. Derek and I are having problems. We've been in counseling for a few months now, and we're not sure if we're going to make it." There was a pause, and then she added, "And before you say anything, this has nothing to do with you or the boundaries we set. This is about issues between Derek and me that we've been avoiding for a long time." Every instinct I had screamed at me to offer advice, to ask probing questions, to insert myself into the situation and try to fix it. Instead, I took a deep breath and said, "I'm sorry you're going through this. That must be really difficult. Is there anything you need from me?" The surprise in Sarah's face was evident even through the video call. "That's it. You're not going to tell me what to do or blame Derek or offer to let me move back to Portland." I smiled sadly. The old me would have done all of those things. The new me understands that you're an adult who can handle her own life, and that the most loving thing I can do is trust you to figure this out. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "That's exactly what I needed to hear, Mom. Thank you." Derek and Sarah separated in February, and Sarah moved with Emma into her own apartment in Sacramento. She called me the day she moved out, not asking for advice or help, just wanting to talk to someone who loved her. I listened, I empathized, and when she finally asked what I thought she should do, I told her honestly that I couldn't make that decision for her, but that I believed in her ability to choose what was right for herself and Emma. Through the spring and summer, as Sarah navigated her separation and eventual divorce, our relationship continued to evolve. She started calling more frequently, sometimes just to chat about her day, or to let Emma say hello to Grandma. I visited Sacramento once, staying in a hotel, and seeing Sarah and Emma for carefully scheduled outings that respected everyone's boundaries. It wasn't the close, enmeshed relationship I had once thought I wanted. It was something better, a relationship between two adults who respected each other's autonomy and could offer support without demands or expectations. I got to watch Emma grow through videos and photos, celebrating her milestones from a distance that no longer felt like abandonment. My own life had become full in ways I never expected. The part-time bookstore job turned into a store manager position. My hiking group became a core group of friends who knew nothing about my past mistakes and loved me for who I was becoming. The writing class led to me joining a local writers group and working on a memoir about my journey. Thomas and I finalized our divorce amicably, both of us acknowledging that we had stayed together far longer than we should have. We maintained a cordial relationship, occasionally meeting for coffee to discuss Sarah and coordinate grandparent responsibilities, now that we were both learning to respect appropriate boundaries. 3 years after that devastating conversation when Sarah first told me to stay out of her marriage, I found myself in a place I never could have imagined. I was single, living in a small apartment, working a job that brought me joy, surrounded by friends and interests that were mine alone. And I had a relationship with my daughter that, while not as close as it once was healthier and more authentic than anything we'd ever had before. Sarah eventually moved back to Portland, not to be near me, but because she had found a good job opportunity and wanted Emma to grow up closer to family. We see each other now every few weeks, always scheduled in advance, always respecting boundaries. Emma, now 5 years old, knows me as Grandma Maggie, someone she's excited to see but not dependent on. Someone who's part of her life but not the center of it. Sometimes I still feel the ache of what I lost, the close bond one once had with Sarah that can never be fully restored. But I've learned that not all losses are tragedies. Sometimes losing something is exactly what we need to find ourselves. When Sarah told me to stay out of her marriage, I thought she was taking everything from me. In reality, she was giving me a gift, the chance to discover who I was beyond being someone's mother. The chance to build a life that was mine, not one lived through someone else. The chance to love without suffocating, to support without controlling, to let go without losing. I took back my life by losing the one I thought I wanted. And in doing so, I found something far more valuable, myself. Today, at 61 years old, I finally understand what it means to be whole on my own, to offer love without conditions, and to respect that the people we love most sometimes need us to step back, so they can fully step into their own lives. That's my story. That's what happened when I stayed out of my daughter's marriage and in the process, stayed out of my own way long enough to finally grow up. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.